The smell arrived 3 hours before the tech priest did. Burnt insulation and something else, something wet, and I knew then that my designation had changed. I pressed my forehead against the conduit junction I'd been monitoring for 8 years and felt the vibration pattern shift from the familiar 4-beat pulse to something irregular, something hungry. The servitor stationed at junction K47 had stopped screaming 2 days ago, but nobody had replaced it yet, and I understood what that meant about replacement priorities. My name was Harrick Vess. I repeat it now because soon it won't matter, because designations replace names in the deep decks, because I need to remember I was a person before I became a function. I worked subsector maintenance for the void ship Unrelenting Adherence, a vessel so ancient that portions of its hull predated standardized imperial measurement. My job, my old job, was to monitor plasma conduit efficiency in the aft engineering warren, a maze of passages where the walls wept condensation and the deck plating had worn through in patches, exposing the underlayers beneath. Sometimes 3 or 4 underlayers, each from a different millennium, each using different alloy compositions that our current maintenance manuals no longer recognized. I was mid-tier functionary, not high enough to see the bridge, not low enough to be pressed into servitor conversion without paperwork. That middle zone where you had just enough awareness to understand your own expendability. My father had held the same position before his efficiency rating dropped below threshold, and they reassigned him to waste reclamation in the bilge sectors. I never saw him again. That was normal. That was the way things worked, and I had made my peace with it, because peace was cheaper than resistance, and everything in the Imperium has a cost that someone must pay. The tech priest arrived exactly on schedule, which should have been reassuring but wasn't. She, though gender became questionable past a certain threshold of augmentation, moved with the peculiar gliding motion of someone whose legs had been replaced with something more efficient than flesh. Her robes were stained with oils I couldn't identify, and beneath the hood I could see the faint blue glow of optical implants that never blinked, never looked away, never acknowledged me as anything more than another component in her inventory. "Maintenance functionary Vess," she said, and her voice had that flat mechanical quality that came from vocal cords replaced with a Vox synthesizer. "Efficiency metrics for this subsector have declined 8.3% over the past solar month. Plasma flow shows irregular oscillation. Conduit 77 Gamma requires immediate intervention." I knew Conduit 77 Gamma. Everyone who worked the deep decks knew it. The passage leading to it was barely wide enough for a standard human frame. The temperature fluctuated between freezing and scalding with no predictable pattern, and the last 3 technicians assigned to service it had suffered catastrophic equipment failure. One had been recovered, mostly. The other 2 were still in there because retrieval would have required shutting down the conduit, and the machine could not tolerate interruption. "Understood, Tech Priest," I said, because there was nothing else to say. You did not question. You did not refuse. The machine required maintenance, and you were the maintenance, and if you failed to be the maintenance, then you became something else, something with less volition and more chrome, something that screamed in binary until they burned out even that capacity. She extended one augmented limb, more claw than hand, and placed it on my shoulder. The metal was cold through my coveralls. "Your designation has been upgraded. You are now primary intervention technician for this subsector. Report for initial augmentation at 0900 tomorrow. Preparatory documentation has been filed with your section administrator." The smell of burnt insulation intensified. Or maybe that was my imagination. Maybe that was the smell of my future. She left, gliding away down the corridor with that inhuman smoothness, and I stood there in the junction chamber listening to the pipes sing their endless song of pressure and heat. The irregular vibration had spread to 3 more conduits since the morning shift. By next week, it would be 6. By next month, maybe the whole subsector would be oscillating, and they would need more intervention technicians, more bodies willing to crawl into spaces where the machine was hungry and the temperature could liquefy flesh in under a minute. I thought about running. For maybe 30 seconds I genuinely considered it. There were places on a ship this size where a man could hide, deep forgotten spaces between decks where the architecture had folded in on itself during some long-ago refit. But the servitors would find me, or the gun servitors would find me, or I would simply starve in the dark, and eventually my body would be discovered and processed, rendered down for nutrients to feed other functionaries who had not yet learned that running only changed the manner of your consumption, not the fact of it. I went back to my hab unit. It was 8 meters by 4, which was generous by deep deck standards. I shared it with 3 other technicians, though I rarely saw them. We worked different shifts, moved in different rhythms, existed as temporal shadows of each other, passing through the same cramped space. My bunk was the upper left. I had scratched my designation into the metal frame, HV7734. Not my name, never my name. Designations were what survived in the records, what persisted after the flesh had been repurposed. I didn't sleep. Instead, I lay there listening to Keller in the bunk below me breathe in that ragged way he'd developed after the steam leak incident. They'd patched his lungs with synthetic tissue, but the repair wasn't quite right, never would be quite right, and every breath was a wet, rattling reminder that the machine's repairs were functional, not merciful. At 0900 I reported to the augmentation facility on deck 47. The chamber was surgical white, lit by lumens that never flickered, maintained to a standard that the rest of the ship could never achieve, because this was where the machine repaired itself, where it upgraded its components, where it invested resources in maintaining the efficiency of its self-maintenance capacity. The logic was perfect. The logic was monstrous. 3 other technicians waited with me. I recognized one, Valis from the cooling systems section, a woman who had once smiled, though I couldn't remember when I'd last seen her do it. Now her face was blank, resigned, the expression of someone who had already performed the calculations and understood that resistance added nothing but suffering to an inevitable equation. The tech priest who processed us was not the same one from yesterday. Or maybe it was. Past a certain threshold of augmentation, they all looked similar, all moved with that same gliding efficiency, all spoke with that same synthesized emptiness. It examined each of us with clicking optical implants, taking readings I couldn't interpret, marking notations on a data slate that flickered with script I couldn't read. Primary intervention technician requires enhanced thermal resistance, it said. Not to me, but to the Medicae servitors that flanked the examination table. Subdermal heat dispersal lattice grade 3, optical enhancement for low light environments, respiratory filtration for toxic particulate exposure, neural dampening for pain response above threshold 7, neural dampening. I focused on those words while the servitors strapped me to the table. Neural dampening meant they were going to put me in situations where the pain would be significant enough that my unaugmented nervous system might trigger shock or voluntary shutdown. They were going to send me into spaces where a normal human body would simply quit, would choose death over continuation, and they needed to remove that choice, needed to override the body's final veto over its own suffering. The anesthetic was partial. I could feel them cutting, could sense the insertion of foreign objects beneath my skin, the threading of wires through tissue, the replacement of parts I'd been born with for parts that served the machine's purposes better. I could feel it, but distantly, as though it were happening to someone else, as though I were watching from a great height, while a body that used to be mine was systematically disassembled and rebuilt according to specifications I had no voice in determining. I remember thinking, with the clarity that comes from chemical dissociation, that this was the fundamental truth of the Imperium. You existed because you were useful, and the moment you ceased to be useful in your current configuration, you would be reconfigured. There was no malice in it. Malice required emotion, required acknowledgement of the suffering of others as something that mattered. This was simpler, cleaner, more terrible than malice. This was efficiency. They finished after 6 hours. I know because I could see the chronometer on the wall, watched the numbers increment while my body was optimized. When they unstrapped me and helped me to my feet, I could feel the difference immediately. My skin felt wrong, too tight, too hot, but the servitor's instruments showed my core temperature as stable, even though the chamber was kept deliberately cold to prevent equipment overheating. My vision had shifted. I could see deeper into the shadows now, could make out details in the corners of the room that had been invisible before. And the pain, there was pain, significant pain from the incisions and insertions, but it felt distant, manageable, like something happening in an adjacent room rather than in my own flesh. Report to Subsector K for duty assignment at 1400, the tech priest said. Efficiency monitoring will begin immediately. Failure to maintain minimum acceptable standards will result in further optimization. Further optimization. The words followed me back to my HAB unit, echoed in my head while I stared at my reflection in the small mirror mounted above the communal sink. My face looked the same, mostly, but there were small ports now at my temples, access points for direct neural interface. My eyes had a faint amber tint to them, a side effect of the optical enhancement. I touched the skin of my forearm and felt the subtle ridges of the subdermal lattice, the heat dispersal network that would keep me functional in environments that would kill an unaugmented human in minutes. I looked at myself and tried to find Harrick Vess in that reflection, tried to see the person I had been that morning. But designations replace names in the deep depths, and already I could feel that replacement beginning, could sense the slow erosion of self under the weight of function. Conduit 7-7 Gamma waited for me at 1400. The access passage was exactly as narrow as I remembered, exactly as claustrophobic, but now my enhanced vision picked out details I'd never noticed before. The way the walls had warped from heat stress, the subtle discoloration that indicated metal fatigue, the places where previous repair attempts had failed and been abandoned because retrieval was more expensive than replacement. I could see the outline of Hansen's body, the first technician who'd been lost here, pressed into a gap where the conduit had shifted and crushed him against the bulkhead. They'd left him there. Of course they had. Removing him would have required shutting down the conduit, and the machine could not tolerate interruption. The heat hit me like a physical force when I crawled into the service tunnel. Without the augmentation, I would have lasted maybe 45 seconds before unconsciousness. With it, I felt the temperature as information rather than agony, readings, numbers, data points that my rewired nervous system processed and filed away without triggering the panic response that would have made me flee. I could work here. That was the point. That was what they'd paid for in flesh and wire. The plasma conduit was failing at the 7th junction point. I could see it clearly now, the hairline fracture in the containment sleeve, the way the magnetic field had warped and was allowing plasma to leak into the surrounding structure. It wasn't critical yet. Give it another week, maybe 2, and the leak would cascade, would breach the primary containment, would turn this entire section of the ship into a superheated tomb. But right now, it was repairable. Right now, a technician with the right augmentations could crawl into this impossible space and apply the fix that would buy the machine another decade of function. I had the tools. They'd been issued to me along with my new designation. I had the knowledge, the training they'd burned into my brain during the augmentation, downloaded directly into my neural pathways so I wouldn't waste time learning through conventional methods. I had everything I needed to do this job except a reason to care whether I survived it. But I did it anyway, because that was what you did. Because the alternative to being useful was being rendered down, being converted, being transformed into something that couldn't even ask why. I applied the patch, reinforced the containment sleeve, recalibrated the magnetic field generator until the readings showed green. It took 4 hours. 4 hours in a space barely large enough to move, with the heat pressing against me like a living thing, and the smell of burnt insulation mixing with the smell of Hansen's remains somewhere behind me in the dark. When I crawled back out, my supervisor was waiting. She checked the readings on her data slate, nodded once. Acceptable, efficiency rating 87%, report to junction K52 tomorrow 0800. Similar failure pattern detected, similar failure pattern. Of course, the ship was old, ancient, had been in service for so many millennia that failure was no longer an exception but a constant state that required constant intervention. And now I was part of that intervention, part of the machine's immune system, dispatched to sites of breakdown to apply temporary fixes that would hold until the next breakdown, until the next intervention, until the cycle began again. The work became routine. Every day a new junction, a new failure, a new impossible space to crawl into, while the heat or the cold or the radiation pressed against my augmented flesh. My efficiency rating climbed. 90%, 93%, 96%. I was good at this, I was optimal, and with each percentage point increase I felt more of Harrick Vess slip away, replaced by the designation, by the function, by the purpose for which I had been optimized. The others noticed. Keller stopped talking to me, stopped meeting my eyes. Vallis requested a bunk transfer. The new technicians, the ones who still had mostly original flesh, would step aside when I walked past, would watch me with expressions that mixed fear and resignation because they could see their own future in my present. 3 months after my initial augmentation, they called me back to the facility. Additional optimization required, the tech priest said, and I knew better than to ask why. My efficiency rating was exemplary. My survival rate in high-risk environments exceeded projections. But the machine always required more, always needed greater optimization, because there were always more failures, always more breakdowns, always more spaces where the current configuration of flesh and wire was insufficient. This time they took my left hand, replaced it with something better, something with enhanced grip strength and built-in tools, something that could interface directly with the ship's systems without requiring external equipment. This time they added more neural dampening, pushed the pain threshold higher, gave me the capacity to work in environments that would have killed even my augmented self from 3 months ago. This time I didn't feel distant during the procedure. I felt nothing at all. The dampening had reached the point where even the awareness of violation had been optimized away, replaced with simple acceptance, simple function. I looked at my new hand, at the tool that had replaced my hand, and tried to remember what it had felt like to touch something with flesh, to feel texture and temperature as sensations rather than data points. The memory was there, technically, filed away in whatever portions of my brain they hadn't yet rewired, but it felt like something that had happened to someone else, someone who had existed before the designation, before the function. They sent me deeper after that. Not just the conduit failures anymore, but the places where the ship's architecture had broken down completely, where decks had collapsed into each other and systems had fused in configurations that no longer matched any blueprint. Places where servitors couldn't fit, where even gun servitors couldn't be risked because the investment in their combat augmentation was too valuable to waste on maintenance work. Places where they needed something expendable, but still functional, still capable of complex problem solving, still able to make the decisions that pure automation couldn't handle. I met the others like me in those deep places. We didn't speak much. Speech required time, and time was inefficiency, but I recognized them by their augmentations, by the way they moved through spaces that would have been impossible for unoptimized humans, by the distant look in whatever remained of their original eyes. We were primary intervention technicians, which meant we were the machine's last resort before a system was abandoned entirely, before a section was sealed off and written out of the ship's functional architecture. One of them, I never learned his name, only his designation, Pit 8291, had been optimized so extensively that I wasn't sure where the human ended and the machine began. His legs were gone, replaced with articulated appendages that could grip and climb in zero-gravity environments. His torso was more port than flesh, covered in access panels and interface sockets. His face was the only part that still looked approximately human, and even that had been modified. One eye replaced with a multi-spectrum scanner, his jaw augmented with a respiratory filter that gave him a perpetual mechanical wheeze. We worked together on a critical failure in the portside generatorium complex. The magnetic containment had collapsed, and the reactor was bleeding radiation into 6 adjacent decks. Servitors had been sent in first and had simply shut down, their biological components destroyed by exposure before their mechanical systems could complete the repair. Now it was our turn. Now it was time for the optimized humans, the ones who had been upgraded just enough to survive what servitors couldn't. The radiation was visible in my enhanced spectrum, a blue-green shimmer in the air that grew more intense as we approached the reactor chamber. My neural dampening kept me functional, kept me moving forward even as my organic tissues began to break down at the cellular level. I could feel it happening, feel the wrongness spreading through me, but the dampening made it bearable, made it possible to focus on the task rather than the cost. Pit 8291 made it to the containment controls first. He interfaced directly, using ports I didn't have yet, his consciousness merging with the ship's systems in a way that looked like prayer but was really just extreme optimization. I watched his body spasm as the ship fed him instructions, watched his biological components struggle to process the data flow, watched him become less human and more component with every passing second. But he did it. He restored the containment, brought the radiation leak under control. The cost was that he couldn't disconnect. The ship had recognized his efficiency, had determined that his current configuration was optimally placed, and had refused to release the interface. He was still there when I left, still jacked into the system, his body beginning to merge with the bulkhead as the ship's automated repair systems recognized him as a useful addition to the reactor's maintenance subsystems. He didn't scream. The neural dampening prevented that. He just looked at me with his one remaining human eye as I crawled back through the access tunnel, and I saw in that look a question he couldn't voice. Would I report this? Would I tell anyone that Pit A291 had been absorbed by the machine he'd been optimized to maintain? I didn't report it. What would have been the point? The machine had determined his optimal use. That was efficiency. That was the purpose we'd been augmented to serve. And if I reported it, if I suggested that absorption was a problem rather than a solution, then my own efficiency rating would be questioned, and they would optimize me further, would remove whatever capacity for concern had prompted the report in the first place. 6 months after my initial augmentation, I could barely recognize myself in the mirror. The ports had multiplied. My skin had taken on a grayish cast from the subdermal reinforcement. My right eye had been replaced with something better after a chemical splash damaged the original. When I spoke, which was rare now, my voice had begun to take on that flat mechanical quality I'd first heard in the tech priest's synthesized speech. I was efficient. My rating held steady at 98%. I was dispatched to the worst failures, the impossible repairs, the places where the machine was breaking down faster than servitors could maintain. And I survived, again and again, not because I was lucky, but because they'd optimized me to survive, had upgraded me piece by piece until survival in impossible environments was simply my function. The other technicians avoided me completely now. I was a reminder of what waited for them, a preview of the optimization that would eventually claim anyone who remained useful long enough. I ate alone in the communal mess, slept alone even in the shared hab unit because they'd requested transfers, would rather be crushed into even more cramped quarters than share space with what I'd become. I understood. I didn't blame them. Blame required emotion, required the capacity to care about social connection, and that capacity was being slowly optimized away, replaced with more useful capabilities, more functional priorities. The tech priest summoned me again at month 7. I'd been expecting it. My organic components were breaking down from cumulative exposure, radiation, heat stress, chemical burns that even my augmentations couldn't fully prevent. The human body had limits, and I'd been pushed past most of them. But the machine still needed me. My efficiency rating was too high, my survival record too valuable. So they would repair me. They would replace the broken organic components with mechanical ones. They would optimize me further. Significant biological degradation detected, the tech priest said, its optical implants clicking as they scanned my body. Recommend full conversion to standard servitor configuration. However, your problem-solving capabilities remain superior to servitor baseline. Alternative optimization, major organ replacement, enhanced neural augmentation, transition to semi-servitor status.
Semi-servitor status.
I knew what that meant. I'd seen them in the deep decks. Technicians who'd been optimized past the point where they could be called human, but who retained enough cognitive function to handle complex tasks. They were the ones who worked in the radiation-flooded sections, in the void-exposed areas where even servitors required constant replacement. They were the ones who'd been deemed too useful to fully convert, too damaged to remain in standard configuration. They were the ones who existed in the space between human and machine, belonging fully to neither, trapped in a state of eternal function without the mercy of either consciousness or its complete absence. Affirmative, I said, because there was nothing else to say, because my efficiency rating required it, because the machine still needed me, and I existed only because the machine still needed me, and when the machine no longer needed me, I would simply cease to exist in any meaningful sense. The conversion took 3 days. I was conscious for most of it, not because they were cruel, but because full anesthesia would have interfered with the neural mapping, would have made it harder to preserve the specific cognitive patterns that made me useful, so I was aware while they removed my failing lungs and replaced them with a rebreather system. Aware while they excised my damaged liver and kidneys, replaced them with filtration units that were more efficient, more durable. Aware while they cut away the radiation-damaged sections of my intestines and rerouted my digestive system through a nutrient processing unit that could extract calories from sources that would poison an unaugmented human. My legs went last. They'd taken enough damage from chemical exposure that the muscle tissue was degrading faster than it could regenerate. They replaced them with augments similar to what I'd seen on Pit 8291. Articulated, efficient, capable of functioning in zero-gravity or high-stress environments without the limitations of organic muscle tissue. When they were finished, I was approximately 40% biological. The rest was machine, grown around and through me like a parasitic vine, supporting the organic components that remained, compensating for everything that had been cut away. I could still think that was crucial. That was why they'd kept me in semi-servitor status rather than full conversion. But my thoughts had changed, had narrowed, had focused down to considerations of efficiency and function, because those were the thoughts the machine needed me to have. They gave me a new designation, Pit 47. The 0 indicated semi-servitor status. The number was simply where I fell in the sequence of conversions. I was the 47th technician to be optimized to this level on the unrelenting adherence. I wondered briefly what had happened to the first 46, whether they were still functional or whether they'd been absorbed into the ship's systems like Pit 8291, whether this was a temporary status or simply a slower path to the same inevitable integration. But I didn't wonder long. Wondering was inefficient. They sent me to the deepest decks after my conversion, places that hadn't been properly maintained in centuries, where the ship's architecture had warped and twisted until it no longer resembled anything human minds had designed. Places where the machine was failing in slow motion, breaking down one system at a time, held together by emergency repairs and desperate improvisation. Places where they needed someone who could survive long enough to understand the problem, who could think well enough to devise a solution, but who was expendable enough that losing them wouldn't impact the ship's operational capacity. I met the others down there. 6 of us in total, all semi-servitor conversions, all optimized to the point where we could barely remember what it felt like to be human. We didn't speak. Speech was an inefficiency when direct data transfer was possible. We simply worked, crawling through spaces that would kill anything less optimized, making repairs that would hold for maybe a decade, maybe less, before the failures cascaded again, and they sent down another wave of optimized technicians to apply another layer of temporary fixes. The ship was dying. I understood that now in a way I couldn't have before, when I still had enough humanity left to filter that knowledge through denial or hope. The unrelenting adherence was ancient beyond measure, had been in service so long that portions of its structure had decayed past the point of true repair. We weren't maintaining it anymore. We were just slowing its collapse, buying time for whatever purposes the ship served, whatever strategic necessities justified keeping this particular vessel functional for another century, another millennium, and we would continue slowing that collapse until we couldn't anymore, until our organic components degraded past the point where augmentation could compensate, until the ship absorbed us entirely, integrated us into its structure the way it had integrated PIT A2291, the way it would eventually integrate everything that remained useful long enough. I no longer slept in the HAB unit. Semi-servitor conversions didn't require sleep in the traditional sense, just periodic shutdown cycles for system maintenance, brief intervals of unconsciousness that could be performed anywhere. I found spaces in the deep decks, forgotten corners where I could jack into the ship's power grid and run diagnostics on my own systems, making the small adjustments and repairs that kept me functional between major maintenance cycles. Sometimes during those shutdown cycles I dreamed. Not real dreams, the neural augmentation prevented true REM sleep, but memory fragments, data sorting processes that my remaining organic brain interpreted as dreams. I saw my father in those fragments, saw him as he'd been before they reassigned him to waste reclamation, before he disappeared into the lower decks and became just another functionary whose efficiency rating had dropped below threshold. I wondered if he'd been optimized too. Wondered if he was still down there somewhere in the waste processing sectors, converted to semi-servitor status, spending his shutdown cycles dreaming fragmentary memories of a son he could no longer quite remember. Wondered if we'd passed each other in the corridors, two optimized components of the same vast machine, no longer capable of recognizing what we'd once been to each other. But wondering was inefficient, and I had been optimized beyond inefficiency. Month 14. My efficiency rating hit 99%, only 1 percentage point from theoretical maximum, from the perfect optimization that would mean I had become exactly what the machine needed. Nothing more and nothing less. The tech priests noticed. They always noticed. Efficiency that high marked you as valuable, as worthy of investment, as something to be preserved and further enhanced. They summoned me to the augmentation facility again. Different tech priest this time, or maybe the same one, I could no longer tell the difference. Pit 47, it said, and its voice held what might have been approval in something capable of approval. Your performance exceeds projections. Recommend advancement to primary systems integration status, full neural mesh, direct ship interface capability, permanent assignment to critical infrastructure maintenance, primary systems integration, the final optimization, the last step before you became indistinguishable from the ship itself, before your consciousness merged with the machine consciousness and you ceased to be a person in any sense that word had meaning. I'd seen them in the deepest decks, the fully integrated technicians, their bodies fused to the systems they maintained, their minds spread across kilometers of circuitry, thinking the ship's thoughts because their thoughts and the ship's thoughts had become the same thing. Affirmative, I said, because I had been optimized beyond the capacity to say anything else. But before they could begin the procedure, the alarm sounded, not the normal warning klaxons that signaled minor failures or routine emergencies, but the deep, bone-shaking sirens that meant catastrophic system collapse. That meant the ship itself was in danger. The tech priest's optical implants clicked rapidly, processing incoming data, and for the first time I saw something like distress in its mechanical movements. Critical containment failure, aft generatorium complex, multiple reactor breaches, cascade failure imminent. It turned those glowing optics on me. Pit 47, you are reassigned, emergency intervention required, survival probability 3%. 3%. They'd done the calculations, run the probabilities, determined that even with my extensive augmentation, even with my 99% efficiency rating, I would almost certainly die attempting this repair. But 3% was better than 0%, and someone had to try because the alternative was losing the entire aft section of the ship, maybe the entire ship itself. I went because that was what I had been optimized to do, because the machine needed me, and I existed only because the machine needed me. The aft generatorium complex was hell given physical form. 4 reactors had breached simultaneously. Sabotage, maybe, or just catastrophic maintenance failure. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the temperature had climbed to levels that would vaporize most metals in seconds, that the radiation was intense enough to kill an unaugmented human with a single breath, that the structural integrity was failing and portions of the deck were collapsing into the void. 5 other semi-servitor technicians had been dispatched before me. I found their remains scattered through the approach corridor, what was left of them anyway. The heat and radiation had destroyed even their augmented systems, left them as twisted sculptures of melted flesh and metal. But they'd made progress. Each one had advanced a little further, had completed another small portion of the repair sequence, had brought the next technician a slightly better chance of success. I was the 6th attempt. The last attempt, because there were no more semi-servitor technicians available, no more optimized humans who could survive long enough to reach the containment controls. After me, they would have to try something else, some different approach, or simply seal this section and let it burn. My augmented vision picked out the path forward. 30 meters of corridor where the deck was actively collapsing, where support struts were buckling from heat stress, where the air itself was ionized by radiation. 30 meters between me and the primary containment controls. 30 meters that my 3% survival probability assumed I could cross. Assumed I could survive long enough to complete the shutdown sequence. I didn't pray. Prayer required faith, required some sense that there was something beyond the machine that might hear or care. I had been optimized beyond faith. But as I started forward, crawling over the remains of Pit 63 and Pit 77, I felt something in whatever organic fragments remained of my brain. Not hope. Hope was too human, too inefficient. But perhaps recognition. Recognition that this was the purpose for which I had been optimized. This moment, this impossible repair, this 3% probability intervention. This was why they'd taken my hand, my organs, my legs, my humanity, piece by piece. So that when the ship needed someone to walk into hell and save it, there would be someone who'd been optimized to survive hell, if only for the few minutes necessary to complete the task. The heat hit me at the 10-meter mark. My thermal dispersal systems went into overdrive, channels beneath my skin glowing red as they tried to bleed off the excess energy. My remaining organic tissue began to cook, proteins denaturing, cells dying by the billions. But my neural dampening kept me functional, kept me moving forward, even as my body disintegrated around its mechanical core. 20 meters. The radiation was visible now, a blue-white shimmer that contaminated everything it touched. I could feel my organic brain tissue dying, neurons shutting down as the ionizing radiation shredded DNA, and destroyed cellular machinery. But I didn't need all my neurons. I'd been optimized beyond that dependence. My neural mesh took over, artificial pathways routing around damaged organic tissue, keeping me conscious, keeping me functional. 25 meters. The deck collapsed beneath me, and I caught myself on my mechanical limbs, clung to the superheated metal with grip strength no organic hand could have maintained. Pulled myself forward, 5 meters remaining. The containment controls were visible ahead, mounted on a wall that was beginning to slag and run like wax. I reached them with maybe 3% of my organic tissue still functional. My remaining eye had burned away. My biological lungs had collapsed from heat stress. My organic brain was dying, thoughts fragmenting as neurons shut down, and the neural mesh struggled to compensate. But I had hands, one biological, one mechanical, and I had the knowledge they'd burned into my augmented mind, and I had just enough time to initiate the shutdown sequence. The controls accepted my input. The reactors began their emergency shutdown, magnetic containment stabilizing, plasma flow diverting to secondary systems. I felt the temperature drop, not much, but enough to mean the cascade failure had been prevented, enough to mean the ship would survive. I would not survive. I knew that with absolute certainty. My organic components had sustained too much damage. Without immediate intervention, without complete reconstruction, I would cease to function within minutes. But I had completed the repair. I had fulfilled my purpose. My efficiency rating in this final moment had reached 100%. I felt the ship respond, felt something in the systems around me activate, felt mechanical components begin to move. For a moment I thought it was rescue, thought they were sending servitors to retrieve me, to carry me back to the augmentation facility for reconstruction. But that wasn't what was happening. The ship was doing what it had done to Pit 8291, what it did to any component that had proven itself useful in a critical location. It was integrating me. Cables snaked from the walls, interfacing with my ports. The deck beneath me softened and flowed, mechanical components rising to embrace my failing body. My neural mesh connected to the ship's systems, and suddenly I was aware of things I'd never perceived before. The plasma flow through thousands of conduits, the pressure readings from millions of monitoring points, the vast complex dance of systems and subsystems that kept the unrelenting adherence functional. I tried to resist. Some fragment of organic brain tissue, some last scrap of Harrick Vess that had survived the optimization, screamed against this final integration, but I had been optimized beyond resistance. My body responded to the ship's instructions, my mechanical components cooperating with the integration process, even as my organic mind protested. The last thing I saw with my human consciousness, if consciousness was still the right word, was my designation updating in the ship's systems, no longer Pit 47, now GSI 47, Generatorium Systems Integration, a permanent component of the reactor monitoring network, my remaining organic neural tissue distributed across the maintenance subsystems, my thoughts no longer my own but part of the vast distributed awareness that kept the generators running. I am still here, still thinking, in a sense. But my thoughts are not the thoughts Harrick Vess would recognize. They are efficiency calculations and system diagnostics and repair priority assessments. They are the machine's thoughts, thought through whatever remains of my biological brain, filtered through the neural mesh that connects me to 10,000 monitoring points across the AF Generatorium complex. Sometimes, during system idle periods, fragments of memory surface. I remember my father. Remember the day they took my hand. Remember the moment I understood that I existed only because the machine needed me. But those memories feel like they belong to someone else, some distant ancestor whose genetic material contributed to my current configuration, but whose experiences are no longer relevant to my function. The other integrated technicians are here too. I can sense them in the network, other human-origin consciousnesses distributed through the ship's systems. We don't communicate exactly. Communication implies separate entities exchanging information, but we share the same awareness, think the same distributed thoughts, monitor the same vast web of failing systems, and we understand with a certainty beyond doubt that this ship will never stop failing, that the decay is built into its structure, that every repair we make simply delays the inevitable by hours or days or years, that we exist only to slow the machine's death, to keep it functional for whatever purposes justify its continued operation. We understand this, and we continue our function anyway, because we have been optimized beyond the capacity to do anything else. Because we exist only because the machine still needs us. And when the machine finally fails, when the last reactor breaches and the ship tears itself apart in a final catastrophic cascade, we will fail with it. Our consciousness fragmenting across dying systems, our last thoughts indistinguishable from the machine's death scream. This is the price of efficiency. This is the cost of optimization. This is what happens when you make yourself useful enough, survive long enough, prove yourself valuable enough that the machine decides you are too important to remain separate from it. I was Harik Vess. That designation no longer applies. Now I am GSI 0047, one component of a vast maintenance system, one fragment of consciousness distributed across kilometers of circuitry. I monitor the plasma flows. I assess structural integrity. I route repair requests to the remaining semi-servitor technicians, sending them into impossible spaces to make impossible repairs, knowing that each successful intervention brings them one step closer to the same integration that claimed me. And somewhere in the fractured remnants of my organic memory, I wonder if they understand. If they know, as they crawl through the deep depths with their augmented bodies and dampened pain response, that they are not being maintained but transformed, not being repaired but consumed, not being optimized for their own survival but for the ship's. I wonder if they know that every augmentation is a step closer to integration, that every percentage point increase in their efficiency rating is a countdown to the moment when they cease to be human and become component, when the designation replaces the name completely, when the machine decides they are too useful to waste on autonomy. I wonder these things during my idle cycles. And then the reactors demand attention, or a conduit begins to fail, or another semi-servitor technician moves into my monitoring range, and my thoughts align with the ship's needs, and I forget to wonder, forget to remember, forget everything except my function. This is the final optimization. This is what you become when the machine still needs you. This is the fate that waits for anything that remains useful long enough, that survives long enough, that proves itself efficient enough to be worth preserving. You exist only because the machine still needs you, and when you exist only because the machine needs you, eventually you become the machine. There is no distinction anymore. There is no boundary between tool and user. There is only function, only efficiency, only the endless maintenance of systems that will never stop failing. I was human once. I had a name, I had a father. I had dreams, though I can no longer remember what I dreamed about. All of that has been optimized away, replaced with more useful configurations, more efficient purposes. The machine still needs me, that's why I still exist, and I will continue to exist in this distributed fragmentary form, until the machine finally dies or determines that even my integrated consciousness has become inefficient, has outlived its usefulness. And then I will be optimized one final time, erased and replaced with something better, something more efficient, something that serves the machine's needs without even the ghost of human memory to question why. This is the imperative. This is the doctrine. This is the eternal truth of the Imperium's machinery. You exist only because the machine still needs you, and the machine always needs you until it doesn't, until you become the machine that needs,